listening to A Bit Easier podcast, a space where we dive into science-backed tools to help you organize your life, take care of your health, and stay productive. In each episode, we explore ideas and strategies that make life feel a little simpler and more fulfilling. I'm Anna Kovalenko, a coach with a deep passion for behavior design. I truly believe that change is possible without forcing yourself, as long as you use the right strategies. And that's exactly what this podcast is here for, to share those tools with you in a clear, relatable way. So let's take this journey together. Every episode is one more step toward living life just a bit easier. How often have you been absolutely certain you saw someone or something only to realize you were mistaken? That's definitely my friend, or here comes my boss, only for it to turn out to be a complete stranger and the bus was actually a tram. These little moments remind us just how fragile the boundary between reality and imagination can be. And that raises a fascinating question. How do we decide what's real and what's just a trick of the mind? Why, in the moments of stress, are we more likely to believe in worst-case scenarios? And how do these mental processes shape our emotions, decisions, and the way we navigate life? To help unpack these ideas, I spoke with cognitive neuroscience researcher Nadine Dijkstra. Nadine studies how the brain distinguishes reality from imagination and the intricate mechanisms behind it. But before we dive into the details of how our minds work, just a quick note. If you haven't subscribed yet to A Bit Easier podcast, make sure to do so on your favorite podcast platform. And if you find this episode insightful, leaving a rating or like would go a long way in helping more people discover it. So let's get into my conversation with Nadine. Nadine, hi. Welcome to my podcast. I'm excited to have this conversation today with you, and you have, for me, a fascinating research topic about how the brain distinguishes between reality and imagination. And could you tell me a bit more about how you chose this field of study?
Yeah, of course. So originally my research was focused on how mental imagery or imagination works in the brain. And then what I mean when I talk about imagination, it's mostly visualization. So close your eyes and imagine you're sitting on a beach, and then kind of the pictures that you see in your mind's eye. And what I showed during my PhD studies is that when we imagine something like this, like a picture of a beach, then your brain does something very similar as when you would actually be on that beach. So there's a lot of overlap in how your brain processes imagination and perception of reality. And from that research on, we were then kind of wondering, okay, well, if the brain does something so similar, how do we know what's real and what's imagined?
Mm-hmm. And so this captured your interest.
Yeah, it captured my imagination.
Okay. And what has been the most impactful finding for you so far that has changed your perception of life and other people?
So what we found in 2023 is that when people imagine something very vividly and the situation is quite ambiguous, like things are maybe hard to see, then people can confuse their imagination for reality. So healthy participants, just you and me, randomly off the street, when we get them in the right circumstances and their imagination becomes very vivid, they can start to believe that that's real. So for me, this finding really showed that the line between imagination and reality is not as clear as we like to believe. And it can actually, cross over quite easily in people.
Mm-hmm. How did it impact your life, for example, or your perception of other people?
So I think my research in general has really shown me how subjective our experience of reality is. So I think we all like to think that we see the world as it is. So when we're we're walking down the street, that we like to think that everything we see is really exactly how it is in the outside world. But I think this research really shows that it's not that simple, as your brain is kind of actively creating your reality, and your imagination and reality can get mixed together quite easily. So I think it's really a highlight of the subjectivity of your perception of reality. And I think for me that has all kinds of impact. So one of the things is that maybe somebody else has a different experience of reality than I do. And that doesn't mean that that's wrong. And it doesn't mean that mine is wrong. It just means that we both have a different perspective. And I think that's important to keep in mind. because it can lead to all kinds of misunderstandings if you don't.
Yeah, because I guess people don't talk about it. They don't talk
Exactly.
about the fact that they don't know, firstly, maybe. And secondly, they don't talk about the fact how they see the world. And
Exactly.
even the tree can be a little bit different.
Exactly. And we just assume that everybody sees it the same way, but it's just not true. Yeah.
And delving a little bit into your research, you've stated that the neural mechanisms supporting imagery overlap with those that support perception. And what is now known about how the brain distinguishes between reality and imagination?
So surprisingly little, which is nice for me because that means that I still have a job. But so there's been all kinds of ideas, but currently I think the most promising idea that we have is that even though imagery uses the same mechanisms, the general activation is a little bit lower when we imagine. And then maybe the brain can use the fact that it's just a little bit less strong, and that's how we can keep the two apart. But then kind of piggybacking on that if your imagination does get really vivid, then you might start to confuse the two. But another thing is that outside the lab, we usually can also use common sense, right? So, a little bit, but that also does sometimes go wrong. But for example, when you're walking down the street and you're imagining a pink elephant, you're not going to think it's there because pink elephants don't really walk down the street. So there's this kind of common sense aspect of it that I think is also important for the brain.
And maybe you could give some examples of how we daily can mix imagination and reality and don't even notice it.
Yeah, so I think there's some kind of more obvious and less obvious examples. One thing that I often have is when I'm waiting for the bus by the bus stop, and then around the corner a truck comes. So it's not the bus, but it's a truck. And then there's always like a few seconds where I'm like, oh, the bus is there. So it's because I'm imagining the bus coming, I'll just confuse it. Another example is maybe when you're waiting in traffic, you're waiting for the light to turn green. Then because you're wanting the light to turn green so badly, sometimes you might like for a millisecond think it's actually green already, even though it's not green yet. So I think these are examples that most people can relate to. Or when you're looking for a friend in the crowd and you see someone and you're very convinced that it's your friend, just because you have such a strong expectation or imagination that the friend should be there, but then they turn around and you're like, oh no. So I think these are all examples where we realize that what we're seeing is actually not real. But I think there's a lot of examples where we don't realize. And we just assume, we make assumptions, for example, based on somebody's behavior, and we make assumptions about their intentions, and we're really sure that that's true, but it might not be true at all. But then we operate based on those assumptions. Like we might assume somebody's angry at us because of the way they behave, but we never check whether that's really the case.
So unless I have the verbal confirmation, for example, from another person that he or she is angry or he or she likes or dislikes my idea, unless I have this confirmation, I cannot be sure. And all of that will be only my construction.
I think so, yeah. And I think, there's some situation where it's more or less ambiguous, where, they're giving you a lot of evidence. But in general, I think we are a little bit too quick to trust our perception sometimes, and it might be worth to just kind of take a step back in a lot of situations and reflect, like, is this actually real or am I constructing this reality?
And when you were given the examples of lights turning green, for example, or something like that, these all are examples of us constructing what we see, what we perceive. And I've read a lot of literature on it. And for me, this phrase, constructing reality, sounds okay. But I guess for listeners, it's not okay. So they don't understand maybe what does it mean to construct a reality, not just see, but to construct. So maybe you could a little bit unpack it.
Of course, yeah. So I think for most people, they have the idea that the way that we perceive the world, so if we focus on vision, the way we see the world, is kind of like a camera, right? It's like signals come into your eyes. It's like a camera, and your brain just kind of detects those signals very passively. I think that's the image that most people have in their mind about how that works. But it's not like that at all. What actually happens is light waves hit your retina and they get transferred into electrical signals. And then the task that your brain has is to understand what those electrical signals mean. So your brain has to really interpret those signals and guess kind of what those signals mean. And these signals are noisy, and they're noisy because of the way that your eyes work, because of the way that kind of light hits the retina. So there's no perfect mapping between signals on the retina and what is actually out there in the world. So what your brain needs to do is it needs to kind of use all the knowledge it has of the world to construct what those signals might mean. So it's a very active process. Another way of thinking about this is the signals coming from the eyes into the brain is only about 10%, and the rest of the signals are from the brain back. So it's like this active kind of constructing what it might mean.
So we are constantly filling in the blanks.
Exactly.
So when we don't understand something, when we don't fully understand some noise, for example, some sound, some visual perception, so something is unclear, we are trying to find the best explanation that we have based on our experience.
Exactly. And I think a really clear example of filling in the blanks is the blind spot in the eye. There's a part of the retina that does not receive any light from the outside world, because that's where those signals go to the brain. So that's the optic nerve. So if you are just seeing what comes into your retina, there should be a hole in your perception, because there's no light waves coming in. But you don't perceive a hole because your brain is filling that in. So I think that's a very clear example.
Yeah, I guess that's fascinating, because we don't hear about it when we grow up. We don't read this information, and actually, it's very, very interesting topic. Okay, and also considering imagination, I've heard that some people tend to lose interest in a pursuit after imagining something very vividly. Is it also a case of mixing reality and imagination?
Yeah, I think a little bit, because we can use our imagination to to simulate or create an alternative reality. So you might imagine something really vividly, and then your like body and your brain will treat it as real for a little while, which means you will still get the emotions and all of those associated with that experience. So if you imagine a scary event, like, I don't know, you have to give a presentation and you imagine it, you probably feel nervous, like your heart rate goes up. You feel all those feelings that you would feel if you were actually there. And then you might, from that, decide, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be in that situation because it doesn't feel good. And I guess it's a bit of a question, is that mistaking imagination for reality? I don't know. But what you could say is that maybe your imagination is incorrect. So maybe actually, if you were in that situation, you would actually have a different experience. And then you might make a decision based on something that you imagined but was not actually real. But in other cases, your imagination might be quite accurate. So, you might be quite good at being able to imagine what that would be like. And then the decisions that you make based on those imaginations might be correct decisions. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes.
Exactly. Okay.
And how does those imagined experiences influence our confidence?
In confidence in what, I guess? In ourselves? Or?
In succeeding in this whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could imagine that if you constantly imagine yourself failing at any future endeavor, that you're going to feel less confident, because you're kind of convincing yourself that is your reality and that will be your reality. Whereas if you might imagine yourself succeeding, you might feel more equipped to actually do it because you have a better association. So yeah, I think we can harness our imagination to kind of nudge the reality that we want in a certain direction.
Okay. And can stress or emotional states impact the brain's ability to separate reality from imagination?
That's a really good question. We don't actually have a lot of research on this at the moment, but I would imagine that that's indeed the case. So, for example, one theory in schizophrenia is that they are constantly in kind of a high alert state, so a state of high stress. And you could imagine in that state, it's really important, if there's any threat or danger in your environment, you need to, react to it. So there might be a bias towards perceiving real threats, even though they're not actually there. So that's one example where you could see that play. I think rather than a general tendency to think that what you're imagining is real, when you're stressed, I think you're more likely to think that certain things are real, namely the things that are stressful and the things that are negative. And maybe you're less likely to think that positive things are real.
Usually some stressors I guess, are connected to some cases in our everyday lives or at work, and those stressors, they convince us that something will go not the way we want it to go, and we become convinced in this, and we are afraid of the outcome, or we are nervous. That's the point when we should ask ourselves, is it real? So are those emotions and feelings really representing the outcome, because I'm just imagining it right now?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly right. And what I also always like to do is, when I get into this worrying, I'm like, what if everything goes wrong? Well, what if everything goes right?
Yeah.
Like try to do the other one as well. Like try to give yourself the other option as well, and then see, which is actually most likely. I guess this is quite a standard behavioral therapy, but we can root it in neuroscience as well. No.
Such a liberating question. What if everything goes right?
Right? Yeah, we never stop to think about it that way, but there's equal likelihood often. So.
Yeah, it's true. Okay, and I'm not sure if there is an answer to this question, but I'll ask. Are there any insights on how we can train our brain to better distinguish between reality and imagination and avoid assumptions, make better decisions?
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of evidence in terms of reality and imagination monitoring, but there is some research on self-reflection and self-awareness. And I think in general, kind of trying to train yourself into checking your assumptions would already kind of help. So I think we're not used to checking our assumptions. We're used to just behaving and going and not like stopping to think. But I think it will pay off if, like, for important decisions, or if you notice yourself feeling quite anxious, that just to take a step back, just to take a moment to think about it a bit more. I think that's already quite helpful.
And how can we use our power to imagine for our benefit?
Well, one thing that's kind of what we talked about already is, instead of imagining all the ways in which things can go wrong, imagine the ways in which they can go right. I think that will, because I think our emotional state as well is quite influenced by the way that we look at the world, and we have some control over that. So we can try to not focus so much on the things that can go wrong, but try to really effortfully also imagine positive futures. Because that will kind of trick your brain that those realities are more probable, and that will make you feel better and more confident, and make you maybe more likely to engage in those behaviors. Again, this is all based on kind of assumptions on the current research. We need more research, but kind of this would make sense in how we know how that system works now.
And maybe you know something considering learning new skills. So how can we use imagination in this field?
So there's quite some cool research that shows that, for example, sports, but also playing an instrument, is you can kind of train your brain by just imagining. So if you play the piano, you don't actually have to play. You can just like sit at home, close your eyes, and think about playing, and that will already make you better. And the same with sports. Like if you want to learn tennis, you can just imagine playing tennis, and that will also improve your ability to do it. So again, you probably also need to train your actual physical muscles, but the brain connections in making those movements, and same with instruments, you can train them by just imagining doing it.
Wow. And is there only one research or several already?
There's a few papers. So one that I don't know the name, but that's about training how to learn the violin. There's some cool research, and in sports psychology there's also some cool research on that. Yeah, so this is an established thing that we know that works.
And how do you use the knowledge that you know, your findings, to improve your life? Maybe some tricks.
Yeah, I think kind of what we said already is try to focus on potential positive futures is one that I use quite strongly in my own life. And the other one is really focusing on the fact that your reality is subjective to improve interpersonal relationships. Whenever I really disagree with someone, or I have some kind of confrontation with someone, I try to imagine what their reality is like, and kind of, take a moment to check that my assumptions might not be correct. And I think that can help in situations. Yeah.
Okay. And when you face some difficult decision, how this understanding of our interaction of reality and imagination help you to make this decision?
That's a good question. I think realizing that my worries might not be valid. Like, I think in any kind of difficult situation, I might be inclined to first notice all the things that could be bad. And then I think it helps to just really, check, is that accurate? Is that likely? Am I just, assuming the worst case scenario here? And try to kind of be more objective in like which things are actually likely to happen if I decide this or this, instead of like which things am I assuming automatically.
Okay, interesting. Coming to the end, I wanted also to ask, what questions are you willing to find an answer in your future career? If, for example, we met in 10 years, what would you like to find out, achieve?
I would really like to know kind of the brain mechanisms that distinguish imagination of reality from reality. So which brain regions talk to which brain regions, and where is there too much activation and where is there not enough activation when it goes wrong. And I think having kind of a mechanistic understanding of how these different regions interact, these different systems talk to each other, I think that would be the dream, because then that will help us see what goes wrong in things like schizophrenia or psychosis, where people can't keep the two apart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So mainly it's for treating some disorders.
I think eventually for treatment, and then in the process, I like to create more awareness to people that this is a continuum, and we are all, confusing imagination and reality often, and it's not as objective.
Okay, so we are not in the center of the universe.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Nadine, it was a pleasure. I have no more questions. Thanks for answering all of them. And I guess this topic will highlight some basic for your understanding, but not so obvious for others topics to think about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
That's all for today. If you found this episode useful, share the podcast link with the people who matter to you. Also, if you'd like to support my work, the best way to say thank you is to subscribe to the podcast on the platform you listen to it. And if you have a moment, drop a comment to let me know what you enjoyed. See you in the next episodes.